Welcome to Maintainable, the podcast where we explore the art and sometimes the mess of software that lasts. We speak with seasoned practitioners who have navigated technical debt, untangled legacy code, and helped teams build sustainable and resilient systems. Because good software isn't just about shipping fast, it's about making it last. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Joel Chippindale, who is a CTO coach with over 20 years of experience leading and growing software teams. These days, he helps engineering leaders build sustainable, high-quality development cultures. Joel joins us from London in the United Kingdom. Joel Chippindale, we're so glad to have you join us in Maintainable. Welcome.
Hi, Robbie. It's great to join you from sunny North London in the UK.
Sunny morning here in Portland, Oregon, where I'm at. A little after 7 a.m. when I'm recording this with you. I love the mornings, so don't get me wrong. But Joel, I have a question for you. Very unique question. I've never asked anyone this question before, but given your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
So for me, there's only one really important thing about well-maintained software, and it's software that's easy to keep changing. And I think that's because that's what we're employed to do as software developers. Change the software to solve problems. If none of the software needed changing, there would be far fewer jobs in software development.
Do you feel like that's a job security tactic that we're maybe subconsciously not thinking about?
I think the demand for change the software is elastic. The easier it is, the more people want. So I'm not worried about that. I don't think we should be worried about losing our jobs on that basis. Though recent changes with AI have got people talking about that again, I think. Personally, I find this sort of definition of maintainable software really useful because it means it's no longer just a property of the code. It's a property of the code and the context, where the context is the business running the software, typically, given we're all paid to write software if we can, and also the team that is working on it.
So we'll dig into a little bit about what you're currently working on in a moment, but I'm thinking of around being able to make easy changes. Are there other sorts of, I feel like I've gone into a lot of code bases where there is a lot of commits happening, but does that necessarily mean that that's well maintained? Just because people are making changes a lot? I think I'm kind of pushing back a little bit on that, only in the sense of, well, there's a lot of code that's being written, but some people listening might be like, this stuff is not being well maintained, but it's changing all the time.
So I suppose it's not about how quickly can you change lines of code. It's about how quickly can you change the software to solve the problems you have to solve. And so it's about the pace of impact you can have. And clearly those are tightly related. Software that you and your team are nervous about making changes to because it might break things, or find it very hard to work out what's going on in the software, and you take ages picking it apart and re-putting it back together to work out what's going on. Or software where when you change something one place, there are all these side effects that you then have to deal with and track down. Those are all things that will slow you down. So if you can't change lines of code quickly, you definitely don't have well-maintained software. But just because you're changing those lines quickly doesn't mean you're having a useful impact. So I think that the challenge is good, Robbie.
Where's that balance between kind of thinking about how software should adapt to maybe the current or upcoming changes that are needed for the software because you've already built in a bunch of functionality features or business logic into your app, but the business is shifting over a little bit to adapt to the new realities of whatever that organization, the reasons why that software was created in the first place is maybe evolving. Where's that balance between like making it easy to make those changes versus say pre-optimizing it or making it very abstract early on for any potential future and I think, do you know where I'm kind of getting at here? Where it's like, this is going to be scalable in any direction we possibly go. Like, is that actually attainable, or is it just that you can start turning the ship a little bit in a different direction?
I think that's a really good point. And all the software you builds into it all the history of all the decisions you've made. And so inevitably, it's easier to change in some ways than others. And as you say, the direction of what you need to do can change over time. The last business I worked at, before I joined, they'd started out as a B2C company, and then they became a B2B company. And of course, some of the things, working with similar technologies, And some of those things transferred well, and some of those things were then baked into the system, this assumption that it's all internal, that were harder to change. And so every piece of software you have is optimized for certain sorts of changes at the moment. And if your business changes around it, then the maintainability of your software can drop dramatically because it's no longer optimized for the sorts of changes you need. So I think that's the first thing. That no software is infinitely easily to change in any direction. I think the second thing, and I think this is really important for us as software developers, there is a great deal of hubris in the industry, and I count myself among these people. It's not everyone else, it's me as well, about our ability to predict the future and predict what's needed next. And these days, I do software technical due diligence for investors on companies at times. And I would say the worst situations I see tend to be self-inflicted in terms of imagining the future they're working towards and trying to pre-optimize for that future. Because it's really hard to solve problems that you don't have yet. And it's really hard to predict the ways in which your software will need to change for the future. So if you're wondering about, shall we make it extensible in this way or this way? And perhaps we'll need in future this. I would really be trying to hold people back from their enthusiasm to make it infinitely changeable. Solve the problems you have now. They're hard enough. And you can understand those because you can work with them.
I think that's a couple of really good points there. Something I hadn't planned on bringing up with you, but in the context of you working with potentially on the other side of maybe providing consulting services or, looking at doing some technical due diligence, we do that at my company as well. Sometimes the companies will come to us and be like, hey, we're considering buying this software project or this app and bringing it in internally, and like, how well might we be able to maintain this? Like, that help them understand the code base, especially if they don't have, say, Ruby on Rails developers currently internally to like really do that. So they'll come to us as like an independent review. So it sounds like you kind of do a little bit of that on your end as well, right?
I have done that in the past. Yes, I don't do much of it now, but yes.
Hey listeners, it's Robbie here. It wasn't all that long ago I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code Maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com. Tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you and start making your app sing. I'm curious, do you think that when you have done that, only because this literally came up in the last week in my company, one of our clients, is that, do you think developers are often building things with the assumption that some other future team entirely might be responsible for this? And what kind of technical decisions or architecture decisions or automated testing decisions are you making that will not hold your organization back from making that a good purchase potentially of your software being purchased by another company? And that's probably a rare, probably not all companies are going to have their software get purchased, but when it does happen, we come in, we look at these code bases, we're like, well, you could probably continue working on this app, but there's a lot of technical debt stuff issues here, have not been upgraded, or there's very little testing because they're a really small team and they didn't think they had the time to do it, yada, yada, yada. And then that is then a less valuable piece of software for that company because they know that it's going to come with a bunch of work to be done on it. Do you have much experience in that kind of things, or am I just kind of...
I don't see that tying particularly to these moments of maybe change of ownership of the code. I think every team I've worked with and every team I've done technical due diligence with, they're all doing their best to make the code as good as it can be for the company they're working for. And that code being maintainable in future, I don't see that very often, or I've not seen that, where a team is there, we're optimizing for 6 months from now because 9 months another team will own it. And in most of the transitions there that I've seen, the people who have built the software have moved over with the company often. And so all of a sudden there's a different owner, but you're still maintaining the software.
So while doing some research for our conversation, I came across one of your blog posts titled, I think it was Take Back Control of Code Quality, where you challenge the common idea that teams have to sacrifice quality in order to move quickly or say stay within budget. So can you unpack that a bit for us?
So I think in software development, the iron triangle, as I think it's called.
So for those listening that might not be familiar, the iron triangle is basically like, what is it? Speed, quality, and was it cost? I think I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. So you have those three things, and then the second part of that is choose two or pick two or whatever. You have to sacrifice one of the other ones. So why do you think that's maybe not actually a thing that we have to always consider when we're working on our projects?
So that iron triangle, pick two from cost, quality, and speed, I think really doesn't work for software. I think software is different. And I think that's true because a huge amount of the work in changing software is around maintenance. I think it's far more than we tend as software engineers or as people managing software teams to admit to ourselves. All the talk is about estimates for new work and but actually much of the cost of that new work is essentially maintenance. It's changing the underlying software so that change is easy. And so high quality software is fast to change. That's back to that definition I gave at the beginning. And so it's cheaper to build high quality software in the long run because you're spending less on maintenance.
Do you get a sense that high quality requires a certain level of, is that a skill set thing, like an experience thing that teams need to, if you have more experienced software developers, you'll have a higher quality of, or is it, because I'm thinking about teams where they're like, well, we might have a few people that are really experts in the software, but the bulk of our team are mid-level developers and they're learning on, we're always learning on the job, but there's maybe not all equally as skilled. And I know that's kind of maybe a subjective way to look at it, but how do you kind of account for that?
Part of it is you're working with the team you have. If you're thinking about the iron triangle, what's the quality, speed, cost relationship that you're working with there? And so part of your job leading your team is to make sure your team is becoming more capable of developing quality software. I think the day-to-day decisions tend to be about, should we save time this week and pay for it forever in maintenance? And there, what I'm encouraging people to is to optimize for the medium term, for the next X weeks. And I think that payback on maintenance comes very quickly. And that's what I mean about that trade-off not really being there between speed and quality. If you develop low quality software, it very quickly becomes very hard to change. And then you've got low quality software that is takes a long time to deliver and you've lost. So I think you've got that immediate challenge immediately every week, which is, are we going to focus just a little bit more on quality? So we're optimizing for a sustainable pace from our team. And then I think the second question as we're working with our teams is, how are we going to make sure that our teams are more capable in future? And that's an investment in the slightly longer term. But it's definitely worthwhile if you're imagining this team and this company is still going to exist in a year's time, which for most of us, that's the case, then we need to be investing in that as well.
What have you seen to be some effective ways of, you mentioned is it literally just hey team, for the next couple of weeks, let's really focus on trying to optimize or improve the quality of X, Y, or Z. maintainability of the software for the next few weeks, and then we'll revisit where we're at and then set some new goals for the next week. And it's hard for me not to kind of compare that to, I'm not like thinking about sports, for example, and like you got a team and you're trying to train them like, okay, we lost that game a couple weeks ago on our defense. We need to really focus on some defense work for the next few weeks, and then we'll revisit what we're focusing on after that point, just to kind of keep leveling up in different areas. Is that kind of how you see that, or shed some light on that for me?
So I think that's one part of it, but I think the core really is about quality isn't something you do at some point. It's part of every part of the work. And I think
it's an artifact maybe of...
Yeah, so quality happens at every stage. Quality is the quality of the conversations you're having about what problem you're trying to solve. You know, you will have lower quality code if you don't have good conversations about that. And then you build something, then you realize when you release it, it's not quite what people needed. And maybe you can hack it back into shape. And often we do. But if the bigger the gap, the harder it is to do that, and the lower quality software you'll end up with. So it's right there from those very first conversations you have. And at every stage along the way, how are you answering those questions about the biggest risks about what you're developing? And maybe that's about how it's used. Maybe that's about how it's built. How are you designing that? How are you developing that? How are you testing that? How are you releasing that? Every single stage has got quality built in. And unless you've got good practices at that level and people thinking about it at all stages, and the maintainability of the software, the ease of change in future, I think it doesn't matter how much time you then do for cleanups, you'll never catch up. That said, it can be valuable at times. You know, everything degrades over, however much you focus on quality, there are all sorts of environmental factors that change. As the direction of the company changes, as software around you changes, new versions become available, new technologies become available. The maintainability of your software just reduces over time just by existing. And there is work to be done there. And sometimes you do need that, let's just spend a couple of weeks cleaning up. That's definitely part of the solution.
I felt like I've been in these situations and exhibited this and hear from a lot of software developers that, you mentioned like it's the quality of the conversations before you're even looking in your code editor, right? And it's like when things get mapped out, or your Jira story ticket, or wherever your team is working on and putting together, documenting what needs to be done, or what new feature needs to happen, or what change you need to make, how you then show up and verify that you understand what you're, ask questions about it, make sure you understand everything and question assumptions, talk through maybe how you're going to approach it. And then you get to the code at some point, you deliver that, you get some feedback, is this kind of aligning? There are a lot of developers that don't necessarily feel like their best area of what they're doing necessarily is in those prep work, and it's like, well, if you just let me, how soon can we get to my editor so I can work on some quality code, let alone like, I just want to get out of these meetings as much as possible, because it seems like everybody's not always in alignment there, but I know that I'm working on code. It's either working or it's not working, yes or no. And it's hard to maybe be in those meetings or those conversations and know did we all walk away? Did we actually all walk away with the same understanding, or did we just get a little exhausted after 55 minutes in the Zoom meeting? And now I'm going to go work on the thing and I understand it. Like, just let me get to the thing. So what do you say to like developers that are kind of maybe in that headspace at times?
So yeah, I completely understand it. I have a background. I studied mathematics at university. One of the things I loved about programming is that it's sort of right or wrong. It works or it doesn't, and you can get a lot of flow out of that. Very quick feedback loops. And it's predictable. Well, to some level, but computers are messy, but compared with humans, they're predictable and clean and organized, There may be software development jobs out there where that works really well, but I've never worked in a company where that would be a software developer's job, just to focus on the code. And I think there's a real danger of us slipping into this idea of the real work is when I'm sat at the editor and all the rest is fluff. Because our job isn't to write code, our job is to solve problems. Writing code is like, at some level, a necessary evil to our work. Maybe it's the writing the code that's the waste at some level rather than rest. And I think to be a really good software developer, I think you do need to develop those human communication skills. It's a team sport. It's about understanding. It's about communication. And that's scary. But in the same way that coding skills can be learned, communication skills can be learned as well. They're not magic and different in some way.
Preparing for our conversation, I learned to talk a little bit about like coming into like working with teams. So like I believe you worked at Unmade at one point, and you helped that team take some steps to improve the maintainability of their software, or maintainability, but not just of the code base software in particular, but as kind of a broader company strategy. So kind of on this point of like, that's like a very specific example of you going into a situation. So what made it clear that something needed to change if it wasn't just the software itself?
So when I arrived at Unmade, the reason they hired me is because they were desperate for change. They knew they needed to change, and had moved from being a B2C company to a B2B company. They had a handful of B2B clients, and they wanted to grow that much faster than they had previously. And at the time, it was taking many, many months of software development work to onboard a single B2B client. And the current client they were onboarding, everyone had raced way past the deadlines. New deadlines were set on a regular basis. Neither the company we were building it for nor ourselves believed in those deadlines. The engineering team were going, we're too busy to talk to anyone. We're just working on getting these features cranked out. Everyone else is, we don't know when anything's going to be delivered. How can we talk to our customers about this? And so in some ways, it made the change very easy because everyone knew that change was needed. And there, the immediate need was to have better communication between people. The engineering team were doing great work, but not showing it to anyone. No one could see any progress. So just making the progress visible to people immediately reduces the pressure. Everyone can see, oh, wow, look at the things they're developing. It's amazing, And then talking to the customer and arranging with them that we would deliver less, but they would have a working version and we could set a date for it. And that immediately makes the code more maintainable, because we're not doing another 18 months work on it and building all these features. We're building just one or two new features, and we're getting into this position where it can launch. And that's really valuable for the customer. And then the moment it launches, the customer still has lots of requirements. They still want lots of things. But what they want has changed completely because they now understand how it works. They're seeing it being used by their customers. And so the things we're building are more valuable. They're less likely to change. There's less pressure because everyone's happy. And then we're able to build in a much more maintainable way.
In one of the parts of that, you were talking about just the scenario where, say, the product stakeholders or whatever the names of those roles were in that organization, where they didn't have visibility into what the developers were working on at that moment, because we've come into those situations a number of times over the years where maybe a CEO will call us and be like, hey, it feels like our team is kind of like everything's kind of jammed up somehow. And can you come in and take a quick look at this to get a sense? There's like, are we completely off the rails here? Or like, is this a personnel problem? Or we used to move so much quicker. I don't understand. There's a lot of those like, help explain this to me because I'm not getting clear answers from the developers themselves, or there's a lack of trust now, or for whatever reason, like they said they could do it in 6 months and it's been 18 months, right? And we don't know if this is going to take 18 more months everybody's skittish to commit to anything anymore because everybody's pointing fingers a little bit. So in that type of situation, what are some ways that do you feel like that was something you could see, like when a team started going a little off that, and be like, did they used to show and demo things more often? And then or this never needed to do that because they were just shipping small iterative things. And this was such a big drastic thing that was like, I don't know when we could show this because it's going to look so broken or unfinished at this point. What was that process like to get them to show progress and to kind of energize and build some trust again with the organization?
So again, I think they got into that situation not because they'd never done it, but because I think these processes you've got feedback loops working on these processes. So for example, this isn't what was going on, but for example, in a situation where you keep delivering lower quality code to get it out as fast as possible, it then becomes slower and slower to deliver. And then you're under more and more pressure to deliver as fast as possible. So you don't have time to focus on quality, and the cycle continues. And I think they got into a similar situation here. This wasn't immediately about quality, but they got to the point where having a meeting to show off the work that's been done and communicate it to people. That's time we could be in front of our computers with our keyboards writing code. And so it felt there's too much pressure. No one wants us to do that. They want us to deliver the things. They want us to deliver all the things. And so everyone wanting what they want and trying to make things work is making the situation worse and worse. And so it takes that stepping back. What we're all trying to achieve here. We need working software for the client that we can put in front of them. Okay, all right. And we need to be able to trust each other in order to do that. And what will build trust is this working changes that people can see and try out and show off. And we won't know the exact deadline straight away, but at least we'll see progress, and that will build trust. And that's where that definition of maintainability, I think, is really useful. If software is easy to keep changing, you can keep showing changes to your stakeholders. That builds trust and it builds alignment. You talk to stakeholders about code quality and they're like, tra-la-la-la-la, that's engineering stuff. You talk about making it easy to make changes, being able to deliver every week useful things that they can show off. Immediately you're all aligned. And so it's building that positive feedback loop instead of a negative feedback loop in there.
We'll be back with our interview with Joel in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to Maintainable. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone in the industry that I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview, Joel Chippindale. Is it your take that maybe generalizing a typical software development team that the metrics or the language that they use to talk about test ratios or the speed of our deployments or builds, like those types of details, not actually helping them communicate with the other parts of the business that are trying to think about like coming at it, be like, we want to make sure this is easy to make changes. Like, it's like, why wouldn't anybody be supportive of that, right? Like, oh yeah, as a business owner, of course, what needs to happen to make this easy to change in the future? Like, I thought that's the point of software, that it's malleable, right? It's soft. And when sometimes developers getting themselves in a pickle where they've talked about like, oh, we have all this technical debt, all these concessions we needed to make. And the owners or, the product owners were like, well, I didn't ask you to cut a bunch of corners that I remember explicitly. So sometimes it's like the developers kind of cut corners themselves to meet a deadline or whatever. Like we make concessions. And then they kind of point back like, well, I had to do this because you were putting pressure on me. And the finger pointing at, I'm air quoting the business right now. But so what are some so that's a thing that I think probably people listening have probably experienced to some degree at some point. I'm assuming you have as well. And then, but when you try to get out of that type of situation and you brought up like showing some visibility and showing your progress, those sound like some early, say, wins that can help build some of that momentum. Are there other sorts of things you've seen or other types of early wins that can start moving the sales in the better direction?
Yeah, I think there's all sorts that can go on there. And it really depends on the challenges you're seeing. So that example there we started with is no one can see any progress. So at some level, everyone assumes there's no progress. What else can you do? You're going to approximate to nothing if you can't see anything. So, well, let's change that and show that off. But there's all sorts of other areas. Another example, given the pressure the team were under, it was completely understandable that when the sales team would say, oh, we're talking to these people, we've got a really exciting new customer lined up, you would see engineers rolling their eyes. Of course they would, because they're going, we're already under the cosh. We've got too much to do. These people, what are they going off selling? And again, that's a dynamic that needs changing because the sales team are trying to do their best to keep the company afloat. That's what I say. I mean, when you own your own company and suddenly have to do sales yourself, it's like, oh, it's great when someone else goes out and does it.
I can relate to that on a lot of levels. I'm thinking about, there's the scenarios like that where you're maybe changing from a B2C or evolving from a B2C to a B2B type piece of software. There's also work that developers need to do that are very much under the hood where from like a end user perspective, from the product owner, it doesn't look or feel like there's a lot of change because the app and the interface hasn't changed, but there's under the hood upgrades, things like that. What sort of strategies have you found to come in those situations to help teams be able to address that and maybe have the product owners or the business people, again, I'm air quoting that, buy into that idea? Is it literally just like, this will make it easier for us to change in the future? Or what other sorts of like approaches have you seen work for that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. It's about telling that story, connecting it to the value it's bringing to the company. And I think it's easy for us, and I certainly did it earlier in my career, to dismiss that. It's like, oh, well, they should know. We're working in a software development business. They should understand. It's up to them. But actually, I think it's definitely on us as engineers to be able to tell that story. And if you're prioritizing this work, you're prioritizing because it's valuable to the company. And so it's valuable. Otherwise, you wouldn't be prioritizing it. While you're upgrading this piece of software here, or whether you're refactoring this piece over here. And telling that story is a really important part of that work. And if you can't tell that story, then I'd question how you know that work is a priority. And are you really working on what's really valuable? So I think it's something, it's not easy. It's a skill to be learned and practiced, and we won't get it right first time. But reaching out and sort of explaining how us solving this problem solves problems for other teams or for our customers is a really valuable thing to do.
What if you, as a developer, are, say, assigned to work on something, or however your process of your team gets work assigned, or you assign things yourself, or somehow magically just happens? You have a body of work, and you're not sure if you understand how this is going to help the business or not at face value of looking at, say, at a Jira ticket or whatever in your linear GitHub issue, whatever it is. And you're looking at this, but it's already been decided that this is going to get worked on, and this needs to be done in the next 2 weeks. Where's that line of being like, I feel like I should probably ask, like, what is this? Why are we doing this? Or is that some people are like, we already decided we're going to do this, so could you please do it? Like, so there's a lot of people that are just work on tickets or whatever. And so any advice for them on how to kind of navigate when it makes sense to raise that versus like maybe just get that, if it's only going to be a day or two worth of work, just do the thing and worry about that on the bigger things? Or where's that line for you?
I don't think you can do good work unless you understand the problems you're solving. So there are definitely companies where there are people and there are tickets and they work on tickets that are just assigned. I've never worked in a company like that. I've never led a team like that. I think it's really important that you understand the problems you're solving and who you're solving them for. And it may be that the decision has already been made, but the why for the decision should be something you should be able to ask about. And I don't know what to advise people who work in an environment where people will not provide those answers if you ask. Maybe, at the very least, if you understand the problem, you've got the chance to solve the problem in a better way than has been outlined, particularly when you're the one who gets into the nuts and bolts of actually how it's working in the system. You're at the coalface there. You will find out things that the people who wrote the ticket didn't understand and didn't know. And unless you understand the why, you're not going to be able to react to those in a useful way. Oh, we don't need to do this because I see this has already happened. Or this isn't going to work because, yes, it will do what's in the ticket. It won't solve the problem. And as a software developer, one of the things that makes the job great is you're paid to use your brain. That's, and if you have to switch bits of that off because you don't understand the problem that you're solving, then you're not able to do great work.
When you're coaching a team that feels, say, overwhelmed by what they perceive to be a fragile system, what's your kind of advice on where to start addressing that?
You see this when you go into a team like this, often you'll find a team where everything feels like a problem. Everything is hard. Everything needs fixing, and at some level, that's one of the dangers of the term technical debt. Every line of code you've ever written is technical debt at some level. If someone else wrote it, it's wrote in a wrong way. If you wrote it 6 months ago, you can already see how you could have done it better, And that before you start taking into account all the things you've learned about the business and what's changed on top of it. And so I think the first thing is really thinking with the team about what are the things that are most holding them back. And then as quickly as possible being able to show progress, being able to show that things can get better. And that means maybe if the biggest thing that's holding the team back is something you go, ooh, that's months of work to fix, you might go for the second or third thing, but you want something that's going to give a tight feedback loop for the team so you can build that belief that we can improve the quality. It's no longer this, everything's broken, everything's awful, no one will give us time, there's no place to start, better just keep coding out the next feature. It's what's getting in the way of our development most? What can we actively change? Let's change that. Let's prove to ourselves that we can make it better. And then we can tell other people, and then we can make bigger investments potentially in improving things. But at least we can believe that change is possible.
Coming to some organizations where they're dealing with that sort of scenario where, I've talked to engineering leaders, they'll be like, all right, we have this weird situation. For years, the team felt like things were brittle, or we've not been able to prioritize some overdue tech debt or whatever, upgrades, you name it. And we've been there like, but over the last year or so, we've been making some, what they perceive to be are some great steps forward, but it's not that the business isn't seeing, like the rest of the business isn't seeing it. The developers are still kind of feeling like things are still messy, like as they always have been, and they're not believing it to be actually that much better. Have you kind of encountered that sort of a situation very often, and or any advice to either those engineering leaders or the developers, like, hey, how do we talk about our wins or a little bit more often, or like, is there a way to do that to show like we are measuring this? Because sometimes it's a subjective thing. Like it feels like we're just buried all the time, or we're just always behind on things, versus like forgetting that 18 months ago you were more buried,
One of the things about working in software development is that there is always more to do than you can possibly do. And you hear a lot of teams, when you talk to them, it's like, well, if we had one more person, we'd be able to do all the work we have. Or if the code was slightly better in this way and this way and this way, then we'd be able to do all the work we have. And that's what I meant earlier on about the sort of demand for software development being quite elastic. If your team is capable of doing more, it will be asked to do more. It's not like all of a sudden the good ideas for what could change will run out. You'll come to the end of the road and everyone will go, you're done. Go away for 2 months. Come back when we've got more work for you. That's not how it works. So I think in terms of that, there's a few things going on. So one is, you're under pressure because of specific deadlines and there's specific things that are hard about the code to work on. And some of the improvements to that are making it easier to work on the code. That's going to make your job more enjoyable, full stop. But it won't mean that you finish. And so I think that's a different conversation to have, really.
That brings up a couple of things in my mind around there's the endless product backlog, right? Or whatever, it's just like it never goes away, right? And I've seen developers at different points in their careers go, it just never stops. I'm like, no, like the greatest thing that could possibly happen with you working on this piece of software is that you or other people get to keep working on this software in 20 years from now. Like that's like a great outcome for everybody if you can still get to keep showing up and doing this type of work. Maybe your goal is that your role changes at some point and maybe you do something different, or you're focused on architecture, or you get promoted and you're engineering manager at some point. There's those sorts of things, but the work still needs to keep happening. Do you think is a little bit around because sometimes projects or software apps and have a lot of work, and whether you're doing 6-week cycles, 2-week sprints, whatever that approach is, it's this continuous ongoing thing, and some people might start to see that as a slog or something, but it's more of a, do you think we're thinking about them more as like isolated initiatives or projects, and then if we framed it in that way, it could be like, hey, we did this big thing, we finished this migration to this thing, and that's a big win. We all knew that this was the outcome, we shipped that thing, and then there's another initiative project thing, and if there was more, you feel like there's just a communication thing around what we're working on or how we're bundling the work into a thing, so it's not just keep working on tickets the rest of my life?
I think this is a huge question, Robbie. I got so many directions I could take this. I think there's a few things going on. So one is I think different people get different things out of their work and value different things. And, You can read a book like Drive or something, and it'll talk about the different elements of what gives people satisfaction. But even if they're the same things, their balance is different for different people, and what people see as autonomy, or people have different desires for how much and in which directions. So it's sort of specific to individuals. I think as a team in general, that shift, if a team feels like it's making progress and feels appreciated by the people around them, then I think that's a huge potential, change for the better, even though there's still always another thing to do, So I think setting up that environment, but also understanding what it is people need to feel like they're achieving things, to feel like it's valuable. For some people, it's what they're working on. For some people, it's the sorts of problems. For some people, it's the sorts of relationships they have, that is most important. And so I think, if you're leading a team, you need to be getting to understand what individuals want. Because as you say, if the reward is you keep getting to do what you're doing forever, that at some level, that's true, but it's also almost certainly not going to be true. Most people are going to move to another job. Even if they stay at the same company, their job will change significantly. And so then I think it's there you're starting to think about what progression means for individuals. But yes, the treadmill of there are always new things to do, that continues to be available. That's what working in a successful company looks like. In fact, the only companies where the requirements stop coming in and the new ideas stop are ones that are ending. And so
this segues over to another thing I wanted to touch on with you quickly was around, I know that you're an advocate for using, I'm going to air quote, boring technology. And so can you tell us a little bit more about that? And then I'm also kind of related to that, what we were just talking about, like sometimes that's what software engineers find to be like, well, if we get to use this new piece of technology, this new thing that's kind of bubbling up, this will be good for my career if we have an opportunity to do this here. But that sometimes might be at odds with the business needs or the business goals of like, well, am I correct that there is maybe a little overlap in that Venn diagram there? And how do you kind of account for that?
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of tension in there. I talk about using boring technology because we're paid to solve problems for the business rather than paid to solve problems with technology. And what's really nice is using technology that solves lots of problems for us rather than technology that creates new ones. I remember when I was first looking at Ruby on Rails, I was a bit nervous about it. I'd read the discussion forums back nearly 20 years ago, and people would talk about how difficult it was to run in production. You can't remember the names of the apps that you would use at the time to keep it running, and people talking about having to restart their app every 10 minutes because it ran out of memory. And I was going, maybe this is too cutting edge. Maybe I'm not ready for this. Because I don't want to be spending lots of my time for a company fighting with getting, an app running on a server. I want that to be easy. I want that to be a solved problem. Solve problems for the business. But there is a tension. How we manage that tension, I think, is an ongoing challenge. When is a new technology boring enough to use? And that depends on the problem you have. If you have a new and exciting problem, you might need a new and exciting technology to solve it. But if you're putting rows in a database, let's pick a relational database that people have used for a very long time that we can trust,
But it would look so good on my resume, Joel.
I think there's a bit of nuance in that as well. Sometimes what I see is people want a new technology because they're not sure what to learn and they're not sure what would be valuable. And a new technology is an easy thing to point at and say, I've learned that. And so I'm not saying that's always the case. But when people say to me they want to learn a new technology, it just rings a little alarm bell. It's like, where is this person going? What are they thinking? What do they really need? And maybe it is that they really want to learn that new technology. I'm not denying that as a possible motivation. But often I find it's more complicated than that. And we already talked about the value of communication skills, for example, which are fully transferable between different technologies, guaranteed, and will be valuable for the rest of your career,
It is an interesting tension, and it's something that I've struggled to know how to like manage my own team at times with things like, well, we're using this thing on this project, but maybe we should switch over and start JavaScript framework X, Y, or Z. And then we're always like, But we've also come into situations where that piece of software is no longer widely used, or we can't upgrade it at some point because the upgrade for that is a complete almost rewrite. And then you can't always guess what that outcome is going to be like, right? And so it's a challenging one. And you're making kind of a long-term decision sometimes when you're doing that. Maybe speaking to your earlier point, is becomes less easy to change or to modify in the future, but you have to make decisions too. So, and you have to kind of live with those decisions. So that is, I guess, the job, right? And hopefully not just so that you can get that on your resume and then your next job, and you can leave that for the next team to pick up and figure it out. But hey, that keeps me employed. So I'll take the work. All right, Joel, a couple of last questions for you. And I want to touch a little bit about what you do and the coaching work that you're doing. I would imagine when engineering leaders are thinking of the idea of like, maybe I should get some external help, either for my team or for myself, that feels like an admission or a very vulnerable situation. So talk about that a little bit in terms of like, how do you help that person listening go, okay, I can bring in and I can accept some inside help or outside external help to come in and like, and still save face to some degree.
And I think it's tough. I think it's tough for us all. I mean, more generally, before you even start about bringing external help, it's tough to say there are still things you need to learn. That can be hard to say, to put your hand up and say, that thing you're talking about, I don't know what it is. Or that thing here, I still need to work on getting that better. But no one is born an amazing engineering leader. We've all had to learn along the way. And I think the further I've got through my career, the more comfortable I've got with saying, I don't know. I remember I used to hide when I was younger, trying to hide the things that I didn't know because I was embarrassed about it. But no one can know everything, and we can all get better. So I think there is something value in us thinking more generally about getting over that. I think more specifically around coaching. Mostly I coach the most senior technology leader at a startup or scale up. That's my typical client. And they typically don't have many people to turn to for advice and support. Sometimes they can turn to their team, and that's great for some things. Sometimes they can turn to their leadership team or their CEO, and that's great for some things. But there are lots of things it's hard to turn to support for. And most of the clients I have reach out to me directly. They go, I could do with some help here. And what the work that I do is really about accelerating people's learning, enabling them to learn faster. I often talk about the experience that I got as a CTO and as a software developer before I got coaching. I learned the expensive way. I learned through slow trial and error. And all the coach does is help you tighten those loops, really, and learn faster. You still make some mistakes, of course. That's part of learning. But maybe they can help you reduce the impact of some of those, or learn, not have to make the same mistake 10 times. Just make it once or twice. But it's scary to say I could be better, but we could all be better.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. We recently heard from a freelance developer. They've been working with one client for years, nights, weekends, fitting things in where they could, but now they're ready for that full-time role again to be their primary focus. They introduced their client to us because they wanted to leave the app in good hands. And that moment, it means a lot. It's vulnerable. They told us that they felt guilty because there wasn't enough time for a lot of automated testing or documentation or some of those long overdue upgrades. They worried that the handoff would be really messy. But here's the thing. The client had thought the world of them, and they were grateful for everything that they had built. And this happens a lot more often than you think. And when it does, we don't show up with judgment. We show up to carry the torch, to help the app take it to its next step, to honor the work that's already been done, because we get it. And we're good at this part. PlanetArgon.com. Again, that's PlanetArgon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. In those scenarios where your clients are reaching out to you, do they often have a sense of what sort of budget they would need for that? Because I would imagine it kind of feels like a very not obvious from the external side. Even when people contact us, they're like, I don't really know what this might take. So I don't even know if I can go back and ask for a budget on something. And sometimes as a consultant, I'm like, well, what's your budget? And I don't even know. Because, if I've never done this before. But then you find out other departments or salespeople get sales training. CEO gets some sort of, they have an executive coach that they've budgeted and they're working with, and like, oh, all these people were doing this for as well, but it's always not. So in that situation, people are reaching out to coaches like you. How soon is like a budget type of thing even come up, or are they tend to be more surprised by how low or how high that of a sort of investment, and not just in cost, but in time as well? Because that is a part of it, right? You have to then be accountable to be coached and to show up for and do the work. You got to do the work, and it's not going to just transfer. You're not going to come in and solve the problems for them.
So coaching has a very wide range of pricing. The pricing is much more variable than you get maybe with, for example, bringing in some people to help you develop your software. So if you're wondering about it, almost all coaches will speak to you for a while and find out a bit about you and share how they work and what it might look like for you. So I would say, if you're wondering, reach out to a few, find out. And if your budget doesn't really match their offer, they can probably recommend some coaches to talk to who might match your budget, So yeah, if you're curious, I would encourage you to talk to someone who does it and see what happens. The other thing I would say is people whose bosses have had coaching often find it much easier to get support for coaching. So the CTOs I work with whose CEOs have had a good coach will be really enthusiastic about getting their CTO coaching.
I think that's a good thing for anyone listening, you should ask your engineering manager or someone up above, like, do you get a coach? Can I get a coach at some point? Because there's lots of coaches for different, all up where you are in your career path, whatever. There's probably people at every one of those paths that you could probably find, get some one-on-one consulting or maybe some team coaching if that's what's necessary for your organization. I'll definitely include links to Joel's information in the show notes for everybody.
The other thing, whatever stage you are in your career, I think Lara Hogan's article, Build a Manager Voltron, is really great. I will share a link. And what Lara talks about there is building a group of people who can support you with different things in your career. And, some of those might be people you pay, like a coach, but some of those might be mentors, some of those might be sponsors. I think it's really useful to think about who in your network you already have, that you have those sorts of relationships with, and which relationships might be missing. What support might you need that you don't have? And then you can start thinking about how you're going to fill those gaps. And I think that's valuable for everyone to be thinking about at any stage in their career.
If you have the time to kind of dig into that, can you share a couple of maybe non-obvious examples for a typical software engineer?
So I think, for example, who are you learning to code better from? And maybe that's from peers. Maybe that's from someone more senior to you across in another department. Maybe that's, what is it that you need support with? What do you feel you're missing in terms of how the team around you supports you or how your manager supports you? So if I think about examples from my career, when I first became a CTO, I reached out to someone who'd previously managed me, who'd already done the job, and said, will you mentor me for the next 6 months, as I start out this role? And of course, that's something they helped with. So, at any stage, I think it's worth thinking about who those people are.
I think the important thing you brought up there is just not everybody has that innate ability to ask, especially maybe to even ask a previous employer or a current employer. It's interesting. Like occasionally I've had a lot of people work for me over the years. You do 20 something years and a lot of people come and go, and that's just the course of life. And I'm always surprised by how rarely sometimes people reach back out. Like I'll reach out, I'm like, hey, do you want to grab coffee? And I think they always think that I'm too busy or whatever. And I'm like, I'm here. I'm happy to chat. I want you to succeed. I saw your potential. I want to hear how you're blossoming. And, if anything, it's just like, how's this going? And I do keep in touch with the first person that gave me a job in tech. And it's been 24 or 5 years ago. And his LinkedIn recommendation was like, here came this scrappy kid, came in one day and I saw some potential. He definitely was not dressed for the interview, but I hired him anyway. And so I know he's proud of me. And so that also is one of those things. So for those listening, reach out to somebody that you haven't talked to in a while. And maybe one of those people could be potentially a mentor, or at least someone you could keep in touch with and get some advice from time to time on your career. But it's okay to do that. We encourage it. All right, Joel, is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
A book that I wish I'd read earlier in my career is Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It by Chris Voss. Great. As I was reading it, I was thinking about all the salary negotiations I'd had in my life and thinking, it would have made a big difference. So I definitely recommend it to anyone thinking about their career. It's non-technical.
It's one of my favorite books. Yes. No, it's a good one. And read the book, and I've listened to the audiobook as well. And Chris Voss, he's a good storyteller. So as well, I'll include links to that in the show notes. It's one of my most recommended books as well. So, all right, Joel. And where can listeners best find your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering and coaching online?
Ooh, you can find me on Mastodon, but we'll share a link because that's probably the best place to find my thoughts online. And there's also my website for coaching, which is monkeysthumb.co.uk.
Awesome. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Joel. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thank you very much, Robbie. It's been a delight.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Autumn Morgan and Ellis Fenson. Emotional support from the letter M. For Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up. See you next time. Maintainable.